In 867 CE, according to medieval chroniclers, King Glar of Northumbria died in a manner so horrific that scribes struggled to describe it. The method was called the blood eagle, a ritual execution that has haunted historical imagination for over 1,000 years. But here's what modern scholars are now asking. Did this torture method actually exist, or have we been repeating a mistranslation for centuries? I'm a historical researcher, and I've spent months examining primary sources, archaeological evidence, and the academic debate surrounding one of history's most disturbing legends. What I found challenges everything popular culture tells you about Viking brutality. The blood eagle appears in medieval Norse sagas as the ultimate punishment, a ritual reserved for the worst enemies of Viking chieftains. According to these texts, the victim's ribs would be severed from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, with the lungs exposed to the air. The accounts are graphic, disturbing, and deeply embedded in how we imagine Viking warfare. But there's a problem. Not a single contemporary account exists. No archaeological evidence supports it, and an increasing number of historians now believe the blood eagle never happened, that it's the result of mistranslated poetry and medieval propaganda written centuries after the Viking Age ended. To understand this debate, we need to examine three critical questions. What do the original sources actually say? Is the procedure even anatomically possible? And why would later writers invent or exaggerate such a practice? Let's start with the sources. The blood eagle appears in exactly 4 medieval texts, all written between the 12th and 13th centuries, at least 200 years after the events they describe. The oldest reference comes from the skaldic poem Nutstroppa, composed around Eling Siling. Then we have 2 Icelandic sagas, the tale of Ragnar's sons and Orkneyinga saga, both written in the 1200s. Finally, there's Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, a Latin chronicle from around 1200. These texts describe the blood eagle being performed on 3 historical figures: King Glar of Northumbria, killed by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in revenge for their father's death; King Edmund of East Anglia, though his death is disputed; and Halfdan, son of King Harald Fairhair of Norway. Here's where it gets complicated. The original Old Norse texts use metaphorical, poetic language. Norse poetry employed elaborate kennings, compound expressions that described things indirectly. When scholars examined the oldest manuscript of Nut, the phrase that has been translated as describing the blood eagle could also mean having an eagle carved on his back, or even the eagle of blood fed on him, possibly referring to carrion birds eating corpses after battle. Dr. Roberta Frank, a professor of medieval studies at Yale, published groundbreaking research in 1984, arguing that the blood eagle was never a real practice. Her analysis of the Old Norse poetry suggests that later saga writers misunderstood poetic metaphors and turned them into literal descriptions. When medieval Icelandic authors encountered phrases like "Ivar let carve the eagle on glass back," they interpreted it as a description of torture, rather than poetic imagery for death in battle. This matters because medieval writers had their own agendas. The sagas were written during the Christian period in Iceland, centuries after conversion. Authors were constructing a pagan past they hadn't witnessed, often sensationalizing Viking-era violence to emphasize how far their society had progressed. The blood eagle became a symbol of pagan savagery, a propaganda tool as much as a historical record. But let's consider the alternative. What if it really happened? Several historians argue that dismissing the blood eagle entirely ignores cultural context. Ritual executions existed in many medieval societies. The Vikings did practice human sacrifice at Uppsala and elsewhere. Archaeological evidence from Repton, England, shows mass Viking graves with evidence of brutal violence. Public executions served political and religious purposes across medieval Europe. Dr. Luke John Murphy of the University of Iceland has argued that, while the anatomical procedure described in later sagas may be exaggerated, some form of post-mortem mutilation or ritualized killing could have occurred. The question isn't whether Vikings were capable of extreme violence. We know they were, but whether this specific method was practiced as described. Which brings us to the anatomical question. Could a person survive the blood eagle, even briefly? Modern medical professionals have weighed in. Dr. Taryn Wills, a medievalist who consulted with surgeons, concluded that severing the ribs from the spine would cause immediate death from shock, blood loss, and collapsed lungs. The dramatic descriptions of victims remaining conscious or even speaking are anatomically impossible. This suggests that even if something called the blood eagle occurred, it couldn't have happened as the sagas describe. The procedure would need to be performed post-mortem, making it a form of corpse desecration rather than torture. So why does this legend persist? Because it fits our cultural expectations of Vikings as brutal warriors from a savage age. It confirms what we want to believe about the medieval past, that it was darker, crueler, and more barbaric than our present. To understand whether the blood eagle was real, we need to examine each alleged case individually and consider what medieval sources actually tell us versus what they omit. Let's start with the most famous case, King Glar of Northumbria. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons, written in the 13th century, Ragnar Lothbrok was captured by Gley and executed by being thrown into a pit of snakes. Ragnar's sons Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and others invaded Northumbria in 867 to avenge their father. After capturing Glar, Ivar allegedly ordered the blood eagle performed. But here's what contemporary sources say. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written much closer to these events, mentions Glah's death in battle against the great heathen army but includes no details about torture or ritual execution. It simply states that the Viking forces killed him. If a Northumbrian king had died in such an extraordinary manner, wouldn't English chroniclers have documented it? The most likely explanation: Glad died in combat or was executed after battle, a common fate for defeated kings. The Blood Eagle narrative was added centuries later by Icelandic saga writers who were constructing a dramatic revenge story. Ragnar Lothbrok himself is a semi-legendary figure whose historical existence is debated. The saga reads like literature, not history. The second case involves King Edmund of East Anglia, who died in 869. Some sources describe him being killed by arrows, others by beheading, and still others mention torture. But no contemporary account mentions the Blood Eagle. Edmund was later canonized as Saint Edmund the Martyr, and his death became surrounded by hagiographic legend. Medieval Christian writers emphasized his martyrdom to create a saint's narrative: Vikings as pagan persecutors, Edmund as Christ-like sufferer. The archaeological evidence from this period shows no trace of the Blood Eagle. Thousands of Viking-age skeletons have been excavated across Scandinavia, Britain, and Ireland. We've found evidence of battle wounds, executions, and sacrificial killings. But no skeleton shows the distinctive rib damage that the Blood Eagle would necessarily leave. Ribs are bones; they would show cut marks, fractures, and separation patterns if this procedure had been performed. Dr. Taryn Wills points out that Viking execution methods we can confirm: beheading, hanging, drowning, and exposure appear repeatedly in both literature and archaeological contexts. The Blood Eagle appears only in literature, and only in texts written long after the fact. So why would medieval Icelandic writers invent or embellish this practice? Several scholars offer compelling explanations. First, the sagas served entertainment purposes. They were recited at feasts and gatherings. Dramatic revenge stories with shocking violence engaged audiences. Second, Christian Iceland was defining itself against its pagan past. Emphasizing Viking brutality justified conversion and reinforced Christian moral superiority. Third, and perhaps most importantly, medieval writers lacked modern skepticism about sources. When 13th century saga authors encountered ambiguous poetry from the 11th century, they interpreted it literally. They filled in gaps, constructed plausible scenes, and turned fragmentary references into detailed narratives. This wasn't deliberate deception, it was how history was written in that era. But this raises a larger question about historical memory. How many other facts about the Vikings are actually medieval misconceptions? The horned helmets they never wore, the barbarism that ignores their sophisticated legal systems, trade networks, and cultural achievements. The Blood Eagle legend reveals how easily mythology becomes accepted history. Does this mean Vikings weren't violent? Absolutely not. The great heathen army devastated Anglo-Saxon England. Viking raids terrorized coastal communities across Europe. Archaeological sites show evidence of massacres, slavery, and brutal warfare. Vikings practiced human sacrifice at religious sites. They weren't peaceful traders misunderstood by history, but they were also complex societies with laws, poetry, craftsmanship, and social structures. Reducing them to bloodthirsty torturers does them a disservice and prevents us from understanding medieval Scandinavian culture in its full complexity. The Blood Eagle legend tells us more about medieval Christian writers and modern popular culture than it does about actual Viking practices. It reflects our fascination with extreme violence and our desire to see the past as fundamentally different from our present. For historical researchers, the Blood Eagle serves as a cautionary tale. Always examine original sources in their original languages. Question narratives written centuries after events. Separate archaeological evidence from literary invention. And remember that medieval chroniclers had their own biases, agendas, and limitations. The truth about Viking executions is disturbing enough without embellishment. King Glahf of Northumbria probably died in battle or was executed after defeat, a common and brutal fate for medieval rulers. That he didn't suffer the Blood Eagle doesn't make his death less significant. It just makes it historical rather than legendary. The Blood Eagle never happened, but the legend of the Blood Eagle tells us something important about how history gets written, rewritten, and weaponized across centuries.